Hi, my name is Christian Sabea and I'm part of the Agenda Management System Team version 1.0, and I'll be going over the installation and maintenance document. A few things to know. You should have Git installed on your computer, and you should have either npm or yarn installed on your computer to manage the node dependencies. As a side note, we chose to use yarn. Another thing that you should note is that you shouldn't use yarn and npm at the same time, so you should never have a package lock.json file or a yarn.lock file at the same time. The following steps were installed on a MacBook Pro using Visual Studio Code, but the steps are as generic as possible that you should be able to do the same on any operating system. So I'll go ahead and open Visual Studio Code. I'll use the integrated terminal so that I could move into a file or directory where I'll want to download the repository. So I'll go ahead and go into my desktop folder, and it's here where I'll want to download the code repository. So the next thing you should do is go to the website where the repository is, and you should find the clonable HTTP link so that you could do a git install or git clone on the project. So as you can see, I copied and pasted the link. I'll go back ahead into Visual Studio Code and I'll do a git clone, and I'll copy that link and press enter. So as you can see here, it's downloading the project. A few things to know is that the link from here from Bitbucket, it might change within time or within semester. So just keep in mind that it's here where you could find, at least here in Bitbucket, where you could find the link to clone it. Once I cloned it, I'll go ahead and open that file here in Visual Studio Code so that I could see the project and file structure. So this is a file structure. We have code, documents, poster, presentation, slides, and video. The code and most of the application is under code and website. So I'll go ahead and cd into that file, which would be agenda management, and then code, and under website. So here you would want to do a yarn. In my case, I already have yarn installed, so I'm going to do yarn install to install the dependencies, in this case on the back end. So as you can see, it's going to create a yarn.lock file. When it's done, I'll show you. So it went ahead and created this yarn.lock file, and it added the node modules. So now once that's done, I'll go inside the client folder, and the client folder is our front end folder, and you also have to install some node modules dependencies. So I'll do the same thing, yarn install, and as you can see here we have a package.json file, so it should be also installing a yarn.lock file inside the client folder. So that created this yarn.lock file inside the client folder. Now I'll go ahead and go back one directory, one directory, and here we're on the root of the project. So from here, another thing that we should do is that we need to add two files into this root of the folder, and the two files are this S3 bucket info.json and the database info.json file. So I'm gonna go ahead and add these into the root of the project. And these two files are necessary because they have some passwords and critical information for the application. So I went ahead and added them. These two files are being ignored, and you can see here that we're ignoring them in this git.ignore. So once that's done, since I already installed the dependencies for the backend and the front end, you could go ahead and do a yarn dev on the root of the project, and that should start up the application. So now that we've finished with the installation of the application, I'll go ahead and do the next part of this video, which is the maintenance document. So for this portion of the video, which would be the maintenance, I'll give a brief overview of where some of the features are within the application. The reason being is because you'll be able to reference our user story videos to get a more in-depth explanation of some of the features we ended up developing. So the first file within the front end portion of our code is that it would go here into source and index.js. And in here, we're importing some necessary libraries from Bootstrap so that we could use it across our application. From here, the only component that it's rendering is app. So in here in app, this is our basically the main file of our application. It's here where we do user level access. And in this portion of the code, we're only rendering the login. And then after that, once they log in, we check if they're an admin, manager, or a user. These three levels of people that could access our application can be found here under roles. And under roles, we have an admin, a manager, and a user. Here, we're defining the API routes that in this case the user can see, which is all of these routes. Eventually, you guys should be able to add more API routes or define them for a manager as well as a admin. The next file I'll be talking about is the assets folder, and here in the assets we have currently two pictures. The first one is this picture. We're using it in the profile and in the icon on the nav bar. The next one would be this 404 page or image, and we're using it to display anytime a user hits an API that they don't have any access to, or if they hit an API route that's not defined. The next folder is here under components, and it's here where we decided to add any files that we thought that we could use across our whole entire application. So some examples would be the footer and the navigation. These components will always be rendered across all of our application no matter what. And then finally, within the front end, the next important folder that's important to talk about is here in pages. We decided to split here and organize it based on folders. So some examples could be the home page, the login page, the profile page, and then the create item page is actually this one, item type. So just to give an explanation of how our file structure is, in this component for this page, we have it split with a container and a view, where the container usually holds all the state of the application, and they could do any logic for HTTP requests to get more information from the backend. Once that's done, if it needs to pass any necessary information to the view of that component, it would pass it as a parameter. So it would render here in home view, for example, we have rendering the menu, the feed, the stats, and notification, and you can see that we're only rendering every single time the container. These can be found here under the components folder. So for the feed, menu, notification, and stats, each folder has its proper container and view, and that's the architecture that we decided to go as a container and view. We also thought of a service oriented, so we split everything together, grouped everything together to have a more organized application. Then from here, the next thing I'll be talking about is the backend portion of our code, which is at the root of our folder, and the main file is here under server.js. Here we're importing Express, some middleware functions that we'll use across the application, and some config files that we'll use across as any, in this case right here. Then we're also using app.use, app.get for the routes that any user would want to hit. Then the login, for example, and the use, the authentication. So for that, we're importing, in the case of like login or the homepage, we're importing these routes, and we split the routes into a routes folder and a controller folder. So for example, for the item controller or the item routes, anytime a user would want to create a new item, it would go into this folder in items. And in here for the routes, we have all the get or put functions of our API. We're actually also importing the controllers just to have another level of abstraction. So we're importing the item controller and the S3 bucket controller. So in the case of the item controller, these can be found here, and I'll go into the item controller, and it's here where we're defining some of the functionality that the user on the front end would be able to do. So in this case, they could have an item view get or an item edit view, and then these functions are being imported into here by this call, and we're calling each function here. So that's basically how we're defining our API on our backend. It's important to know that you should have these two files, the S3 bucket info.json and database.info.json files on the root of the project. They're actually being ignored because there's some information there. But to get a few more or further explanation on these two files should be here on the database folder. If you have any questions, you could contact me at these two emails.